My name's Jeff Webb, and I've been involved with IRPA for really quite a long time. I went to the second Congress in Brighton, where I now live, in 1970. And I became president of IRPA in 2000 to 2004. A new group of people emerged, and they called themselves health physicists, because it was obviously something to do with health, and it was something to do with physics. And the name health physics meant sufficiently little to anyone that the security people could handle it, and so they called themselves health physicists. A very important person in the early days of our profession took over in 1949, Elder Anderson. And she started to think that maybe this subject she was teaching could actually be a profession instead of just an odd thing that people did. Of course, any profession needs a conference. And so the first thing you do is to have a conference. First one was Ohio State University in June 1955. And Elder Anderson had put one particular session into this conference, and the Atomic Energy Commission Fellowship alumni, in other words, the guys that had been through the mill, after presumably enough drinks, someone said, "Hey guys, why don't we have a society?" And they all said, "Yeah, that's a good idea." And so the next morning, they found they'd got a society. And they formed that provisional society the next day, in June 1955. Elder Anderson definitely was the woman behind it all. And so, despite Elder Anderson doing all the work and getting the whole thing up and running, the first president of this new society was K.Z. Morgan. Anyway, K.Z. Morgan pressed on and expanded his ad hoc committee to 46 people from 25 countries. Well, you can't work with a committee of 46 people. So you set up a subcommittee, which was only about 7 people, I think. The subcommittee were pretty clear that they were happy about all of this. And they said at the end of their presentation to the Health Physics Society Board, "We are in unanimous agreement that we wish to move towards a single health physics or radiation protection society." Meanwhile, back in the USA, the Health Physics Society Board took this recommendation on, and they said, "OK, let's move this forward. We will create a pro-tempore executive council for this new organisation, whatever it might be." And so they created it, with a few members picked out of the ad hoc committee. And they agreed on the articles, which wasn't surprising because 7 of them were the people who'd written the articles in the first place. So you'd expect them to agree. And they decided, let's call it the International Radiation Protection Association. And John Dunster favoured an organisation of national or regional societies. On the other hand, Ruprecht Moushart favoured an association of individual members who didn't have to belong to national societies. Why should they? The other thing they did at that meeting in Gatlinburg was to actually draft a constitution for IRPA, taking the Articles of Agreement you've seen, adding a couple of new ones, like establishing new societies. It was an objective of IRPA right from the beginning to establish societies in the countries that it needed. And they made a decision which I've not been able to find out quite why it was made, to only have one society per country or region, which has given problems, as you know, some of you, for the UK in particular. And for final endorsement, they held a joint meeting of this pro-tempore Executive Council and the Health Physics Society Board. K.Z. Morgan presented all this material to the joint meeting. Ruprecht Moushart didn't give in easily. He had another go at his idea of individual members, supported by Pierre Pallerin from France, the French Society. But not surprisingly, they didn't make it, and the meeting agreed with the Gatlinburg text. They then decided, having set up a pro-tempore Executive Council, that they'd better set up a pro-tempore General Assembly for this organisation that still didn't exist. And so that met in Paris, December 1964. It was hosted by what was then still the French section of the Health Physics Society. And it was quite a good meeting. They had a good number of people there, 15 societies, 6 other countries represented. K.Z. Morgan recalls in his notes that they were very much an adversarial, that they had the pro-tempore Executive Council sitting one side of the table and the delegates sitting the other side, glaring at each other. But nonetheless, they did quite a lot of work. This was the Executive Council side of the meeting, and you'll see some faces there. On the left is Hulter from Belgium and Marco from Canada. There's Ruprecht Moushart in the middle, bending over, making some notes. This is the only photograph I ever found of him wearing a suit and a tie, and a black suit and a tie. But obviously, that's what you had to wear if you were on the executive in those days. Next to Ruprecht is Courvoisier of Switzerland, who was the first treasurer and the longest-serving member of the executive. He was treasurer for something like 6 executive councils. On the left photo, you can see next to him Duhamel from France and Jamet, Henri Jamet from France. 3 French were in this pro-tem executive council. And in the right-hand picture, you can see Hart from the US, Benko from Italy, and a young Nishiwaki from Japan. First, they adopted the constitution. It's quite interesting. The primary objective in that constitution was protection of man and his environment. IRPA wrote it into their constitution in 1964. Was that looking ahead, or was that looking ahead? And they made an interesting addition, which was to have quite serious ramifications later on. The Israeli delegate, oddly enough, suggested adding a phrase to say the place of the Congress should enable any delegates to attend the meeting, which seems reasonable. It's a non-political society. It's a professional society. Okay. They had 3 nations who were offering to host the first Congress. They had a vote and chose Italy and Rome as the location of the first Congress. But they also realised that they hadn't yet got an organisation. They were only a pro-tempore General Assembly. So they had to work towards actually having an organisation. So in a kind of chicken and egg situation, the pro-tempore General Assembly, which had been called into being by the pro-tempore Executive Council, decided to create a provisional Executive Council, because a provisional Executive Council has a lot more authority than a pro-tempore one. So we've now got a provisional Executive Council, which met. And not only did they create it, they gave it the power to declare the existence of IRPA once you'd got 4 associate societies with at least 1,000 members. And the first 4 societies that were admitted that made this criterion, of course, the Health Physics Society had to be one of them. It's the only one big enough to make the 1,000 members. But then the French Society, what was then the Central European Society, which is Austria, Germany and Switzerland, which is now the Fachverband. In fact, by the time of the Rome Congress, it had become the Fachverband. And the little Luxembourg Society. We weren't one of them, which was a shame, really. We could have been. And so the formation date of IRPA was the meeting that admitted these 4 societies, which I've decided was June the 19th, 1965. It wasn't quite as clear as that because there were some problems, and it wasn't until a later meeting that they decided the Luxembourg Society actually did have 20 members, and so it qualified as a society. But they decided retrospectively that it had qualified as a society, so it went back to June the 19th, 1965. IRPA, of course, didn't have any money. It hadn't had a meeting, it hadn't had any dues, hadn't even had a General Assembly to decide what the dues would be. But you need money to work on. So it got loans from the various societies around. But before all of these loans, IRPA had one rather special piece of income. $1 that was vested in IRPA by K.Z. Morgan while he was still chairman of the pro-tempore Executive Council in token of IRPA's future vitality. And this was kept by Peter Courvoisier, the first treasurer, It was turned over by him to Ruprecht Moushart, who was later treasurer. Ruprecht kept it and eventually passed it on to me, and it's now in the IRPA archives. The first Congress was held in Rome, as you know, at the Hilton. It was quite well attended, 845 people, and it set the scene for all future IRPA Congresses in that they decided to cover the whole spectrum of health physics or radiation protection. And we've tried to continue doing that ever since. There were two opening plenary sessions. One was by Casey Morgan, which was basically how IRPA came into being, and the other was by Bill Pochin, or of course Sir Edward Pochin, as we had to call him later on, and that was on critical doses to critical tissues, and it was really a resume of ICRP publication 9 from 1965. The opening of the Congress was pretty low-key. You can see some of the people here. Polvani, on the far side, is the vice president for the Congress, who helped to organise it. Calderola, also from Italy, who was the president of the Congress. That was something that happened at the first Congress and didn't happen after that, to have a president. And then there's Casey Morgan, of course, and Bonnie Mori, who was to become the first executive officer. But as you can see, it was IRPA on the stand, and it was a fairly low-key operation. First General Assembly, the first real General Assembly now, was held during the Rome Congress, and they elected the first Executive Council, and of course they elected the first President, and no prizes for guessing who the first President was. It was, of course, Casey Morgan, who had been either President or Chairman of everything up to there. It was a pretty good Executive Council. We had Nishiwaki from Japan as Vice President. Now that sounds very good and very multinational, but of course Nishiwaki at that time was working in America for Casey Morgan. What a coincidence. Greg Marley, who was the Vice President, because they also chose the location of the next Congress in Brighton. And people like Dan Benenson and Boo Lindell on the first Executive Council, a pretty powerful group of people. And at the end of the General Assembly, according to Casey Morgan, the Provisional Executive Council proudly thrust the baton into the waiting hands of the newly elected officers, shouting, "Godspeed, and may you succeed in making and preserving this as a truly international organisation in which persons engaged in radiation protection in all the countries of the world can associate and work together for the common good of mankind." You don't get that sort of thing in General Assemblies these days. It's a shame, really. The Italians not only had the first Congress, but they also managed to arrange a papal audience. And so all the delegates trooped up to the Summer Palace outside Rome and had an audience with the Pope and a blessing. Dan Benenson said afterwards he was quite scared that as he walked through the door he'd be struck down because he was a real confirmed atheist. But in the end he walked out the other end without any problem at all. By the second meeting of the first Executive Council, people were getting worried that Casey Morgan was dominating the whole thing. And particularly the people like Dan Benenson and Boo Lindell, who were on ICRP, were worried because it was becoming very clear at that stage that Casey Morgan was very opposed to ICRP and to the general consensus on radiation safety. And they were worried he might take this new organisation, which he had basically created, and turn it into a really powerful opponent to ICRP. Things came to a head when Casey Morgan proposed some committees. In fact, he proposed 12 committees: judiciary, finance, membership, regional congresses. He also proposed the chairman of every committee and all the members of every committee that he had selected. And this came to a head, and again, the minutes record a long discussion. I think you can imagine what kind of long discussion that would have been, because at the end, Casey Morgan lost. The Executive Council asserted its authority and said, no, we don't take your suggestions of committees or people or chairmen. We will decide what's going to happen in this executive, and we will involve the societies as well. And so at that point, things started to go wrong for KZ. Nonetheless, they were nice people, and they decided towards the end of his term of office, 4 years, to establish a post of President Emeritus. And they approved this at the second Congress in Brighton, and KZ Morgan became the first and indeed the only holder of this President Emeritus role. So the 12 good men on the executive became 13 good men from that point on. KZ Morgan carried on coming to Executive Council meetings, but he lost his influence, and as is ever so clear from his correspondence at the time, he lost his patience as well. He just dismissed them all. And these were the people he dismissed. You can still see KZ on the front row at the left, attending, and then there are people like John Horan, Greg Marley, who was to become the second president of IRPA, and then you've got Parmiter and Polvani, Walter Snyder on the extreme right of the front row, then the editor of Health Physics and IRPA Publications Director, still trying to keep those two things together. And on the back row, on the left, you've got Henri Jamet, and next to him, Bou Lindell. So the organisation was going really quite well. And by the early 70s, we'd got a pretty good membership, 5,500, 18 societies. But even so, there was concern that it wasn't growing fast enough, and Polvani, who was then the vice president, decided to establish a committee on membership promotion. And he had a list of target countries. Some of these are quite interesting because they are now long-standing members of IRPA, like Australia, New Zealand, Spain. And of course this is still on the agenda of the current Executive Council. We're still trying to generate new countries and new members. So this is a real ongoing problem. One of the other things that the Executive decided to do was to establish a lecture in his honour. And the first Sievert lecture was given, appropriately enough, by Bou Lindell, also from Sweden, in 1973. And this is a particularly interesting photograph for me, because if you could turn it round and look into the audience, you'd see a young Jeff Webb sitting there looking at Bou Lindell giving this lecture, Radiation and Man. But he started it with a tribute to Rolf Sievert. Quite a flowery tribute for Bou. He said, "No pictures, no quotations, no descriptions can do Rolf Sievert justice. Those who were never subjected to that forceful vitality and the cascade of ideas, innovations, problems and solutions that flowed from Sievert in a glittering, boisterous torrent will never be able to see in the dead pictures the man he was to us who knew him." He then went on to give his lecture when he talked about a thing called PQR, which you'll probably know better these days as cost-benefit analysis. That was what he first called it. First time I'd ever heard about cost-benefit analysis, and it caught my attention. And I worked on it on and off for about 30 years after that. But this was the first time I heard it from Bou Lindell in Washington. A very happy Greg Marley presenting the first Sievert Award. All good organisations have to have a symbol. And in 1973, the Czechoslovak Society presented some ideas to the Executive Council from a Czech artist, Pavel Svab. And he picked up the trefoil idea and started to come up with some ideas, some of which were a bit weird, I must say. The Executive Council picked one that they liked and then generated a short list and had a vote on it to pick the one we now have, which of course you all know. And of course you also all know that this symbol succeeded in converting the negative, suppressive meaning of the trefoil into a positive one, symbolising protection, health and prosperity. Even IRPA couldn't avoid politics. The Fourth Congress was going to be held in Prague. After the Washington Congress, there was a vote. Prague won the day. But the Czech authorities, this was the time of apartheid in South Africa, of course, and the Czech authorities said, we could not guarantee that the delegation from South Africa would be admitted. If you recall, the Israeli amendment to the Constitution said the place must allow access to anyone. And so the Executive Council were in a bit of a bind over this. So they scurried around a lot and eventually decided that they would go back to the second bidder, which was France, and have the Fourth Congress in Paris, which is why Fourth Congress ended up in Paris. It was a very good one too. Henri Jamet became then the vice president for the Congress. But Jamet had other interests as well. And in particular, he was developing an interest in the early 70s in non-ionising radiation and the idea you might actually have to do some protection against non-ionising radiation. IRPA explored this idea. They first contacted ICRP and said, you're going to deal with this, aren't you? And ICRP said, no, this is not our baby at all. We'll leave it to someone else. So IRPA took the initiative and set up an exploratory committee on non-ionising radiation with Henri Jamet chairing it. And at the beginning of the Paris Congress in 1977, Henri gave a plenary lecture on non-ionising radiation to, I must say, an almost totally bemused audience who hadn't a clue what he was talking about. But nonetheless, he made an impression, because at that General Assembly, they voted to set up a formal committee, the International Non-Ionising Radiation Committee. It didn't all go smoothly because this committee rather wanted to become an equivalent to ICRP. And IRPA wanted this committee to stay under its umbrella and under the control of the Executive Council. So things were a bit tense, but nonetheless, INIRC did a huge amount of work from the late 70s through the 1980s. It produced guidelines on most forms of non-ionising radiation with WHO and UNEP help, covering all of these areas. And it culminated in a major landmark, which was the publication in 1991 of the IRPA guidelines on protection against non-ionising radiation. A real success story for IRPA, I think, to have generated that and produced useful guidelines. Eventually, after more than 15 years, the chairmanship of INIRC passed over to Mike Repiccioli. And Mike Repiccioli is quite a go-getter, and he wasn't content to sit under IRPA for any longer. So he started drafting a charter for this new organisation. He talked it through the Executive Council, and eventually in Montreal, on May 1992, the ICNIRP Charter was signed by John Lakey, who was then the President, Charlie Meinhold, Vice President, Chris Huiskens, the Executive Officer, and of course Mike Repiccioli. And thus ICNIRP, as we know and love it, came into being. But a real success, I think, for IRPA. Just take you back very briefly to IRPA 7 in Sydney, which was just before the Montreal meeting, because this was an interesting one, partly because it was the first IRPA Congress in the Southern Hemisphere, and partly because it was actually three things. There was the IRPA Congress, the following week there was an IAEA conference, and sandwiched in between the two was the Diamond Jubilee of ICRP. So it was quite a coup for Sydney to have these three meetings all together. And it also gives me a chance to show you a picture of two of the most powerful thinkers in radiation protection at that time, Dan Benenson and Bu Lindell. A couple of extra pictures to show you. This is the 8th Executive Council, and I show this because you can see in the middle there a much younger looking me, on my first Executive Council as Publications Director. You can also see some other younger-looking people, Jacques Lochard, Phil Metcalfe, who later became President, Charlie Meinhold, who was President at that time, and Ruprecht Maushart. It's the opening ceremony of the 9th Congress in Vienna, partly to show that it was becoming a much more formal operation. In the middle there, chairing it, we have Hans Blix, then the DG of the IAEA, and only a couple of people on the rostrum actually from IRPA. I hope this has been interesting to people who didn't know quite so much about how this organisation came into being, and particularly for the younger, relatively younger members of the